I'm just Nick, and this is the Earthquaker Devices White Light Overdrive. I'll be honest with you, most pedals that are termed overdrive pedals repel me. I find them lacking in expression. They sound, to me, or at least for the way I play, kind of generic. They are very compressed often. There are notable exceptions out there. Some of them are called overdrive pedals, many of them aren't, but they fill that low to medium gain range. Catlin Bread makes some. Earthquaker Devices make some. This is one of the most notable exceptions to the rule that I've experienced lately. It is something that is called an overdrive pedal that I really, really like. And one of the reasons I really like it is it has a dynamic response that in some ways is similar to a really good fuzz face, which is to say, it is both dynamic in terms of how distorted it gets with your picking, but it's also dynamic in terms of how it shifts the timbre, shifts the kind of quality of the tone a little bit based on how you pick. So you can get kind of more mid-range content as you dig in more. More upper mid-range kind of cut and bite. And together, those two kind of dimensions of dynamic response make for a very, very expressive pedal with a whole range of colors that you can access with just your fingers or perhaps your volume control. This pedal also cleans up beautifully with the volume control. And this is not always the case with some expressive fuzz pedals, that they respond in such a kind of linear, smooth way to the volume control without ever sounding strangely thin or hyped or anything like that as you change settings. So let's have a quick listen to the clean sound that we're working with today, because it's kind of important in the context of demoing this pedal. We're plugged into a Silverface Princeton reverb. The sound is a little bit on the dark side at the moment because this is the only pedal in the chain and we're running two reasonably long cables. So we have a little bit of high-end roll-off. But it's a typical Fender Silverface, Blackface type sound. Tends to be quite bright, have a lot of high-end, a little bit of scoop mids. And this is a single coil Tele type guitar that is also quite bright. And I chose this amp because often this type of amp can be quite unforgiving of overdrives, particularly ones that aren't compressed and don't have a big mid-range bump to them. Not so with this pedal. It mates beautifully with this amp and other amps I've tried it with. Even though it has that brightness and that string-to-string definition and beautiful clarity and lack of mud, it does not sound harsh or strangely over bright with this or other similarly bright amps. Let's have a look at the gain range available to us. At full counterclockwise, we have just a hint of grit and a little bit of added brightness. This is not a transparent pedal, as it were. It does color your tone at all settings. There's just a little bit of upper mid-range emphasis, which gives us a nice bite, but there's nothing hyped about it. It sounds really, really natural. At full clockwise, we're going to get into some pretty heavy tones that are saturated in a little bit of a fuzz type of way. but still remain very, very dynamic, and the bottom end still remains shockingly tight. It doesn't compress out. Those characteristics also make this pedal really, really good for stacking. I've tried it with some pretty heavy distortions before and after. I've tried it into a dirty amp. It works very, very well and tends to sort of mush out on the bass a lot less than most distortion devices. There's an additional control here in the middle that's kind of unique to this pedal. At least the name of it is. It's called the weight control, and that's a really apt description. At full counterclockwise, it kind of rolls off some of the low and low mid-range. And leaves most of our distortion action on the upper mid-range and high end. At the full clockwise position, it really fattens up the lower mid-range and lows. And this control is not only useful for sort of dialing in the pedal to work with a particular amp or guitar, it's also extremely useful in dialing in your tone to work well in whatever live or studio mix you're working with. In a very dense mix, whether we're talking about a recording or a live mix where you have maybe multiple guitars or, God forbid, some keyboards, you might want to roll things back and go with a tone that's a little bit more focused and narrow and has less lows and low mid-range that could quickly turn into mud that mask other parts that mask you. In a more open mix where perhaps you're the only guitar, maybe you're playing in a trio, and perhaps you're playing a guitar that is a little bit on the thinner, brighter side, like a single coil Telecaster type guitar, and you want a little bit more fat on your overdriven or distorted tones, you go clockwise. So that's heavy weight and somewhat lighter weight. And you'll note that we're getting a lot of variation here, but none of it sounds hyped. It doesn't sound over the top. And I don't know, somebody's got good ears. They put a very well-voiced control on here. Finally, we have a comp switch. We've been on the minus position this entire time, which gives us a more dynamic, less compressed sound. Less compressed sound. When we move to the plus position, and I'm going to compensate for a little bit of a volume drop, things smooth out just a bit. They don't get, I'm not going to use the CR word, they don't get like that. They just get a little bit less spiky. The attack transient is just a little bit more attenuated, and we have a little bit more sustain. So plus position, minus position. It's a subtle but important difference, and it's the kind of difference you're really going to feel, again, in a live or recorded mix, especially as the player. That response is going to either help you pop out through the mix or sit back just a little bit into the mix. I really, really like, as a guitar player who also does a lot of recording, I like to be able to dial in my mix, in a sense, at the instrument with the part I choose to play, the way I adjust the controls on the guitar and on the amp and on any pedals I'm using, and get the sound that's really going to fit nicely into that mix up front. The more I can do that up front, the less work I have to do on the back end with EQ and dynamics processing. And I find that, at least for the way I like to work and the sounds I like, I tend to get better results that way. This is the type of pedal that very simply and easily allows you to, make the adjustments to get yourself a dynamic sound, but one that can work in, whatever the context. So I think it's a great device. I actually feel really confident using this as a, as my only distortion device on a board, because it has that kind of range and that kind of expressiveness. There's not much else to say. Get a hold of the folks at Rock and Roll Vintage, and they will totally, totally hook you up with an Earthquaker Devices White Light Overdrive. Till next time.